A judge on Wednesday sentenced the killer of four Idaho college students to life in prison with no chance of parole. The killer, Bryan Kohberger, declined to speak or explain his motives, something that victims' family members, close followers of the case, and even U.S. President Donald Trump had wanted him to do. Judge Stephen Hippler described Mr. Kohberger as a coward who had slithered into a home in Moscow, Idaho in November 2022 and fatally stabbed the victims. Many of the students' friends and relatives spoke of their loss and fury.
He is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse. He chose destruction. He chose evil. He feels nothing. He tried to take everything from me. My friends, my safety, my identity, my future. He took their lives, but I will continue trying to be like them to make them proud.
As for his sentence, we support the plea agreement. Society needs to be protected against this evil. As for the defendant, we will not waste words, nor will we fall into hatred and bitterness. Evil has many faces, and we now know this, but evil does not deserve our time and attention. We are done being victims. We are taking back our lives.
For more on this, our correspondent Wyatt Sharpe joins me now in studio. Wyatt, I want to start with the verdict. So why did the judge choose life in prison with no chance of parole opposed to the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with the plea deal that was reached that Bryan Kohberger ultimately obviously agreed to, and that was he would agree to plead guilty with, the intent, obviously, that they would revoke the death penalty as kind of the consequence there. That was something that obviously Bryan Kohberger didn't want, but I think it kind of gets into the dispute that was happening even amongst kind of the victims' family members because, some of them were wanting the death penalty and some of them were wanting the result that ended up coming of this plea deal, which was, of course, the consecutive life sentences. There are four of them, essentially, so one after the other to kind of symbolize justice for each one of the victims in the stabbings themselves. Now, it kind of also gets into the debate that oftentimes happens between whether or not the death penalty is something that actually is an effective way to bring somebody to justice, because on one hand, people argue that, it's the same thing that he did to the victims themselves, which was, of course, taking the life away. He should have to go through the same experience that he, traumatically, obviously, caused the victims to go through themselves. Whereas other people argue that in order for someone to truly be brought to justice, they should have to suffer for the remainder of their lives, in prison. And so that's kind of the back and forth dispute that we've been seeing on this topic in particular. And again, it kind of just illustrates how much tension there is over this. Of course, the other thing that's interesting here is that the judge, of course, has also been making a number of different comments with respect to how they feel Bryan Kohberger went about doing this. And, perhaps one of the interesting things that hasn't been talked about a lot as much in the mainstream news is that Bryan Kohberger actually had an alias that he was using, allegedly anyways, on social media, where he was unveiling a whole bunch of details about the case even after he committed, again, these atrocious acts that he committed in Idaho. He was using an alias on social media to go out and post details about the case, things like where he had parked, things like, which route he went in order to get into the house. And that's kind of how some of the details of this case began to unfold and how it began to get more information. And so it's interesting in that regard because I think what it symbolizes to some people is that Bryan Kohberger didn't just take satisfaction in actually killing them again traumatically himself, but also in kind of the after effect. It was like an adrenaline thing for him, where he was just overall satisfied with getting all of the attention and the limelight, and he continued doing that. So people think that maybe by giving him the death penalty, he wouldn't actually have to suffer that much because he would, not be around whereas if he's in a jail cell, for the remainder of his life, he's going to have to go through the same suffering that he's now causing these families to go through without having their loved ones.
Right, or feel any sort of remorse. And I think a big takeaway from what happened was the fact that he chose to not speak in court. What do you make of that, and how much significance does that carry?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who wanted him to. If you look even to someone like President Trump, for example, he had said that he wanted Bryan Kohberger to speak in court. Really, I think people are trying to understand something that really isn't able to be understood, and that is why someone would go about doing that. You saw actually one of the victim's sisters in her statement in court call Bryan Kohberger a psychopath, a sociopath, a narcissist. I mean, she actually went on offense, which is different because usually in, testimonies before the court, especially for something as somber as this, you would expect to see kind of more of the emotional side of things. She had actually said before she went up and gave her remarks that she gave, again, that were much more kind of offensive.
Mhm.
She had said that she actually thought about like even going back and saying different things that she had written in her journal and kind of turning that into her remarks instead. So people usually take it as an opportunity to just express their feelings. And so people were wondering if Bryan Kohberger actually were to give remarks before the court, again, maybe it could help to explain some of what happened here. His lawyers and his attorneys, I imagined, are probably the driving factor behind why he didn't. It could obviously implicate further kind of criminal liability if he decided to testify and then, of course, said something that he didn't want to say or said, say something that hadn't yet been uncovered. And so that could have implicated him a little bit further, perhaps, as well. But I would say, I mean, when he came out and he said that he was going to respectfully decline to make any remarks, that actually made people quite frustrated, obviously, in itself, because Bryan Kohberger is obviously not someone who's very well liked. He's someone who people have a lot of strong feelings against. And I think him coming out and not even just saying it, but the way he said it, he didn't really seem to feel any remorse, I think drove a number of other kind of feelings of hatred towards him amongst the population.
And what do you make of some of the testimonies that his friends and family had come out with and said during court? You touched on one that they came out with a lot of anger, but were
Yeah.
the other ones, did they follow that same suit, or were a lot spoken with more emotion?
Yeah, and I mean, first I'll just say, like, some people on social media have been trying to say that the sister of one of the victims who did use kind of the more anger, kind of going on offense type of approach, that, it was unprofessional or that it was unjustified. I'll just stop there and just say that anyone who has went through what she and the family members of the other victims have went through, I think it's actually probably one of the most powerful victim statements I've ever watched anyways, because I think she's saying something that obviously any victim of anybody, of, any relative who has went through something this tragic would very much feel the same thing. So I don't think, the criticism towards her is justified whatsoever. I think her coming out here, saying what she said, especially in a public spotlight with, if millions, if not tens of millions of people watching, is something that should be commended. But with respect to the other family members, you had, the parents, obviously, of people who came out. Some family members even said that they didn't want to testify because they didn't want to give him kind of the luxury of seeing them kind of talking about his actions and further giving him the spotlight even more, which is one thing I think that's actually important to note and maybe question moving forward, is for someone who it is obvious just enjoys kind of living in the spotlight and getting all of the attention, why would we continue to give him the spotlight in the presence of a trial where, there's people watching and, again, millions of people online? But the other family members, again, took kind of a much more emotional approach to things. They talked about how amazing, some of the memories that they had in the past were with some of their family members, really just kind of making it, again, an emotional setting just for people to really understand who the people were. One thing I also found interesting, it was one of the moms actually who had came out and said this in one of her in her statement, was talking directly to Bryan Kohberger, where she had said, if you had have went up to my daughter in her everyday life, she would have, I think she said, given you directions. She would have told you, where to go. She would have awkwardly laughed at you if you had said something, that was ridiculous. And so, like, really just trying to, I don't want to say make light of the situation, but just really illustrate, not just for Bryan Kohberger, because it's apparent that he just doesn't care, but for, the rest of the world, the lives that Bryan Kohberger took away were lives of people who, were valued, who were smart, who were nice people, super kind in kind of their everyday life. So certainly it was a sad day, I think, in the courtroom yesterday, but I think the victim statements were very powerful that they delivered and things that will be remembered as to how to make an effective victim statement.
Well, and I think the purpose of the victim statement is to humanize the victims and to take them away from the terrible thing that had happened, but to make people remember that these are people too, with families and friends and things like that. But this case really blew up on social media. When it first had come out in November of 2022, it was all over TikTok, and there were a lot of speculations around what was the truth and what had actually happened. How much do you think how big a role social media played on this case played into public figures speaking out on it, like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, it's just another example of kind of the true crime mysteries, if you will, that people are growing more and more
Mhm.
attached to. Even if you look to Luigi Mangione back in December when he assassinated the United Healthcare CEO, people were just as drawn to that because I think people just like going down kind of the conspiracy rabbit holes and trying to develop their kind of own opinions on some of these
Mhm.
issues. And so that was certainly the case for this time as well. But I think what was unique here is that Bryan Kohberger himself, again, used a bunch of different aliases, allegedly, anyways, on social media to try and add some new kind of details and factors into the case himself. So naturally, people were turning to social media as a way to try and understand the case. I also think that because there's so much tension and conflict over a case like this, there's a lot of lawyers and attorneys and commentators who are providing their perspective to ultimately help the public be better informed and to not just understand the facts of the case, but understand how the proceedings work. And so that's why even in kind of the lead up to the case itself, you had a number of different remarks that were being made as to how people can expect kind of the proceedings to play out.
Well, Wyatt, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll have more of today's top national and international headlines right after the break.